So I see we have Chairman Mr. McAllister. Mr. Chairman?
I cannot see you in any case.
Good to see you, Professor Urbinati. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to introduce myself to you as the first and biggest member of your fan club.
Thank you so much. Look, I cannot see you though.
That's because I haven't switched on my video. I haven't put my makeup on yet.
Oh, okay, try to do it quickly.
Dear both, just to remind you that we're not in the practice session anymore and we're live on YouTube. So we will start in 1 minute. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're live already. We've started recording.
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. McAllister, can you hear us? Can you test your microphone, please?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Thank you very much. We can hear you well.
Yes.
Hello.
Mr. Chairman. So.
I think we should start. Jonathan, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jonathan Murphy, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this global conference on parliamentary innovations, adapting the capacities of parliaments to changing democracies. We look forward to 3 days of exciting presentations, debate, and dialogue on key issues in parliamentary innovation. Our first session is today. The second session is on December the 8th and the third on December the 10th. I'll introduce the agenda for this first session, which should be shared on the screen, and briefly go over the agenda. So we will begin with introductory remarks from Chairman David McAllister from the European Parliament, be followed by a keynote speech by Nadia Urbinati, the Professor of Political Theory at Columbia University. We have discussant Maureen Khan from the Financial Times, where she is EU correspondent based in Brussels. Then we will have a Q&A session, and we hope to wrap up just around 4:30. So it'll be a session that's an hour and a half. I will start by introducing the conference organizing partners. First, the European Parliament, and specifically the Director General for External Policies of the Union, the European Commission, and specifically within the European Commission, the Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development. And finally, the Inter-Pares Parliaments in Partnership Programme, which I head. Inter-Pares is the European Union's first global programme to strengthen the capacity of parliaments and is delivered by International IDEA, an intergovernmental organisation celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. We thank the European Parliament for the virtual hosting of this event in support of democratic capacity development in countries outside the European Union. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to apologize on behalf of the European Commissioner for International Partnerships, Jutta Urpilainen, who could not be here today due to other commitments. I am very honored to invite David McAllister to open the conference. Mr. McAllister from Germany has been an MP since 2014. He's the chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs at the European Parliament since 2017, and he is also the Vice President of the European People's Party since 2015. Before being elected as a member of the European Parliament, Mr. McAllister has had a stellar career in German politics, rising to become Minister President of Lower Saxony from 2010 to 2013. Mr. McAllister is no stranger to the world of international democracy strengthening. Apart from his engagement in several developing democracies, he is co-chair of the European Parliament's Democracy Support and Election Coordination Group. Over to you, Mr. McAllister.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Murphy, for these kind words of introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this international conference, Parliaments and Democratic Innovations Adapting the Capacities of Parliaments to Changing Democracies. Let me, first of all, sitting here in my office in Brussels, thank the co-organisers of this important event, Inter-Pares, the European Commission, and let me thank all those involved for their excellent cooperation and support. I am pleased to see the participation of colleagues from various national parliaments, as well as of scholars and experts in parliamentary and democracy studies, and I'm looking forward to Professor Urbinati's introductory speech. This conference shows the willingness of the European Parliament to, how can I put it, become a hub of democracy with national parliaments. For many years, the committee that I have the honor to chair, the Foreign Affairs Committee, has developed a strong cooperation with national parliaments. For instance, every 6 months under each member state's presidency of the Council, the member states' parliamentarians meet together with the members of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee for the Common Foreign and Security Policy and the Common Security and Defence Policy at an interparliamentary conference. Together with national parliaments in our member states, the European Parliament has been committed to this important forum for parliamentary exchange on EU foreign and security policy for many years. Having chaired the IPC, I believe the IPC allows to have elected lawmakers have a chance to make their voices heard through the adoption of conclusions and joint statements, even more so under these current challenging circumstances. Interparliamentary committee meetings are another important forum, bringing thematic committees together. Tomorrow, for example, the Committee on Foreign Affairs is holding an interparliamentary meeting with colleagues from national parliaments on the situation in the Western Balkans and in Belarus. Now, I'm sitting here in my office in locked down Brussels, and we are all witnessing across the continent that the pandemic has made our endeavor to strengthen democracy even more urgent and necessary. The COVID-19 crisis has shown the importance of parliaments in advancing the interests of citizens and supporting democracy. The European Parliament provided immediate backing to the very valuable efforts of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in devising a rapid response to the pandemic in policy terms of an international outreach. History has shown us strong democracies need vibrant parliaments as their allies. Supporting parliaments, for me, means in the end, therefore, one of the most effective tools to strengthen democracy worldwide in these challenging times. Defending the status quo, however, is not enough. In order to be successful, democracies must continuously reinvent themselves. In the last few years, new innovative forms of democracy have taken shape. New proposals from civil society or the establishment of so-called citizens' assemblies composed of randomly selected citizens represent important experience that deserve our analysis. In the European Parliament, for example, we are observing the French initiative to establish a Citizens' Convention on Climate, composed of 150 randomly selected citizens. Our colleagues from the French National Assembly will offer some fresh insights into this experience. Other countries in the European Union have had similar experience on other matters of interest for their electorate. It's now time to carry out a review of these experiences. This conference represents the first international forum where members of parliaments and experts will be able to assess the impact of these innovations on parliaments and how these innovations could and should reinforce the central role of parliaments. A final remark, dear participants. I am aware that members of parliaments may have different opinions regarding these innovations. Some of you have expressed doubts about the legitimacy of assemblies composed of randomly selected citizens, and I believe that we need to take these concerns seriously. Others take a different view. Some parliaments at regional level, including the one in Brussels, have even formally integrated such novelties into their functioning tools. So there's obviously a diversity of approaches. Rather than being an obstacle for our discussion, this should make our debate even more interesting and vibrant. However, finally, I want to be clear on one point. Nothing can replace elections as a democratic means to select the representatives of citizens with a mandate by the citizens and for the benefit of the citizens. It is only free and fair elections that provide the legitimacy to present our citizens in the institutions. In this regard, citizens' assemblies and other deliberative bodies can be useful as long as they are complementary in their role in supporting parliaments and feed their work into our parliamentary work. The second topic discussed at this conference is also of great importance, COVID-19, and how it has changed our parliament's work. For the first time in history, many parliamentary assemblies have adopted new virtual proceedings. The introduction of these new virtual forms of participation has ensured continuity in our parliamentary work. New technology has provided tools for parliaments to carry out their main functions even in periods of unexpected crisis. The European Parliament has certainly been at the forefront of this modernization effort in parliamentary culture and organization. The pandemic has highlighted the importance of planning and preparing for the future. Parliamentary institutions must be ready to quickly adapt to unexpected crises. In this regard, the establishment in Finland of a parliamentary committee for the future is of great interest for all of us, and I'm glad to see that the chairman is among us at this virtual conference. So, in conclusion, I would like to stress that these discussions should not be only theoretical. This conference has an ambition to provide policymakers engaged in parliamentary capacity building with concrete practical tools for action that could help to strengthen parliaments worldwide. So with these thoughts, once again, a warm welcome to all of you, and I wish us all a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman McAllister, for those inspiring words to begin the conference. And we very much appreciate your participation and the full engagement of the European Parliament in this interesting conference. It's a great honor now for me personally to introduce to you Nadia Urbinati, Professor Urbinati. She has been one of my most important influences since I first read her 2006 tour de force, Representative Democracy, Principles and Genealogy. Professor Urbinati is Professor of Political Theory at Columbia University in New York. She's a political theorist specialized in modern and contemporary political thought and the democratic and the anti-democratic traditions. She's the author of numerous highly influential books and papers on representative democracy, most recently publishing last year, Me the People, How Populism Transforms Democracy. And she's also a political columnist for Italian newspapers. She's been a member of the School of Social Sciences of the Institute for Advanced Study and a Rockefeller Visiting Fellow, both at Princeton University. She is permanent visiting professor at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, in Italy, and she has taught, among other institutions, at Bocconi University in Milan, Sciences Po in Paris, and the University Unicamp in Brazil. Nadia, we look forward to hearing your comments.
So, well, I thank Interpares, certainly, and the people who made this event possible, and in particular Francesco Ronchi, and a special thanks to Jonathan Murphy and the chairman, David McAllister. Thank you to all of you. Now, the topic of your conference is parliamentary innovation. It requires, I think, an overview of the main issues and problems and potentials for transformations and innovations, and this is what I would like to do in my brief presentation, just sketching some problems. So parliamentary democracy, that is to say representative democracy based on free and cyclical elections with free mandate representatives, is the outcome of a complex and at times tragic history. Its fortune and stabilization is still open to question. Nothing is a given in the world of politics, and particularly in parliamentary politics. Particularly when political communities had the ambition, as our communities in Europe, of creating a continental parliament, integrating and working with national parliaments, a complication that on the one hand is a challenge, on the other hand, it comes in a moment in which parliamentary democracy is under stress. So we should never forget that, first of all, the constitution of parliamentary democracy came as the result of a struggle against anti-democratic projects. What we call today parliamentary democracy has been an achievement after several failures. The failure of the Italian liberal state in 1922, of the Weimar Republic in 1933, of the French parliamentary democracy in 1938. They proved that the role of the rule of law and constitutionalism they were not strong enough shield to guarantee liberty and social stability at the same time. Political and ideological party conflicts would reinforce democratic stability only once citizens on different points of the political spectrum would recognize themselves to be part of the same communal project, as Jürgen Habermas wrote years ago. That recognition did not come spontaneously, though, nor was it simply the outcome of endorsing a constitutional democracy, which is, as we can see today in Europe, a political order under dispute and even disruption and contestation. It is clear that a parliamentary democracy without a constitution based on fundamental rights that are not in the hand of the majority is not a parliamentary democracy, but a new form of despotism of the majority. We have also to consider that the parliament is in itself an institution that democrats don't digest easily. The parliament had historically the role of limiting the absolute power of the monarch. Yet its pluralistic and debating nature and its surveillance and checking function made it also a power capable of limiting the executive when the executive became the expression of an elected majority. To sum thus, the parliament limits in effect the power of the democratic sovereign and installs an elite of politicians distant from the people they claim to represent. As the parliament entails plurality of voices, debates, and compromise, its function has been for a long time identified with liberal politics rather than democracy. The confrontation between Carl Schmitt and Hans Kelsen was memorable on this issue. Today, the contestation of parliamentary politics as a breaking of the unitary collective sovereign and as the realm of an elite distant from the people seem to be back and strong again. And this is what populism is about. In this presentation, I would like to invite you to ask questions that reveal the problems connected with parliamentary democracy and the reason why there is distress in parliamentary democracy and this dissatisfaction with parliamentary democracy. Two are the challenges we detect almost daily. First, and the first comes from the contestation by the citizens who feel to be neglected, unheard, and impotent in their means of communication with their parliaments. The second challenge comes from the growing authority of the executive, which means of the decision moment above the collective deliberative moment. The economic crisis of 2008 and the COVID pandemic now have accelerated this process of decisionism and the growth of an apical power of the government's leaders, even in parliamentary democracies. So parliament seems to be obsolete and dysfunctional. But we tend to forget that when we think this way, we imply that our vote is obsolete and dysfunctional, that politics based on consent and public judgment and the elections is obsolete and dysfunctional. And this is a risk we don't want to face. At any rate, whereas anarchy and civic unrest marked the decline of the old parliamentary government before fascism, apathy, distance, disenchantment seem to erode today's parliamentary democracy. To those who envision a more decisionistic government and an increasing role of competence in lawmaking, not simply in administration and bureaucracy, seem to think that apathy is a blessing. Yet parliamentary democracy with an apathetic citizenry is in a bad, not good health. The paradox of parliamentary democracy is that while taking away the lawmaking power from the citizens, it becomes weak without political actions by the citizens, without keeping on a permanent communication with them. Of course, communication between parliament and the society is no problem free. Equal as electors, we citizens are unequal and different on several accounts, and our differences surface when we form opinions and we vote. The political mandates through parties have tried to solve this problem, particularly after the defeat of monocratic, despotic, or fascist regimes. As we know, political parties have promised to give powers to citizens' voices. Moreover, they were able to tame and limit political conflicts and stabilize society without sacrificing pluralism and competition. Yet political parties do not guarantee that all interests and ideas are represented, or their factional interests are expelled from parliaments, or that compromise produces good decisions. This brings me to the Other reasons of discontent in parliamentary democracy. The parliament is a vivid image of the gap existing in electoral democracies between represented and representatives, between the citizens and the parliament. This gap is important and is managed in a society that wants representative democracy to approximate the democratic principles of self-government. Thus, communication between institutions and extra-institutional lies is one key function for dealing with this problem and managing the gap without overcoming it. Communication is performed by several intermediary means, including political parties, civil associations, movements, the media, and now also the internet. Thanks to them, citizens try to give their political presence an effective and persistent character through time. Their strength and social rootedness signal the strength of democratic representation, insofar as they allow decision makers to always be in relation with and inspected by those who receive laws and are both the main source of inspiration for representatives and the public tribunal that judges them. However, communication is not a final remedy and not, as I said, problem-free, because although it manages the gap, it also injects citizen dissatisfaction within the parliament and the elected. Furthermore, communication can hardly avoid partiality in judgment. It makes it impossible to insulate the law from society's divided interests and partisan politics. Communication makes a lawmaking assembly the echo chamber of society's passions, visions, and interests. The side effect of parliamentary politics is to make the assembly the target of citizens' distress. The distress in representative reverberates on the practice of lawmaking, which wrenches the aura of rationality and impartiality traditionally ascribed to the law. This is a permanent issue in parliamentary democracy, the tension between partisan interests and the ideal of impartiality are traditionally ascribed to the law. In sum, challenges from the executive power inside and challenges from civil society and ordinary citizens outside. So parliamentary democracies are losing perceived legitimacy on these two sides. And we have to pay attention to this criticism in order to be able to devise innovation and transformation that can strengthen the parliament, not weakening it. To explain the recent explosion of talks and writings on the crisis of democracy, scholars have called into question representative institutions and interpreted the decline of voter turnout, trust in politicians, and interest in politics as symptoms of electoral representation's agony. This perception of parliamentary democracy stress tells us that the problems faced by representation in today's democracies comes from, one, the ways representatives operate, and two, the way the public functions. In a word, we face issues of functions of the institution of parliament and issues of communication of that institution with the outside. As to the former issue, the question of functioning, elected politicians are immersed in practices that favor political corruption instead of preventing it. This perversion comes primarily from the flow of private money in electoral campaigns, yet it also emerges from the weakening process of party politics. How to remedy this problem of oligarchic degeneracy and, in effect, increasing distance between the elected and the electors? This calls into question democracy's institutional imagination. As to the other problem, the relation with the public, The media system feels the allure of the audience as much as politicians do, and tends to become an organ of entertainment that ceases to check representatives, to monitor and control institutions. Moreover, thanks to the oligarchic ownership and control of the means of information and communication, citizens with greater economic power have more chances to elect the representative they prefer, and thus facilitate laws that favor their interests. All in all, the combination of private money and political power is an oligarchic breach of democracy. And within this situation, what is generally good, that is communication, may become a vice. Parliaments are far from innocent. Let's mention the issues that need to be adjusted. Democracy, first issue is democracy's leadership. Democracy is not leaderless. However, it requires a broad competition for selections of leaders and the circulation of leaders. Democracy opposes the formation of a separate class that split the collective into two groups, the rulers and the ruled. It is a shared conception among political theorists that the democratic character of representation consists in that it activates a circular current of judgment and opinion that keeps institutions under people's eye and imposes power limitation on the elected. This goal is fulfilled by regular and free elections with short-term tenure and the limitation of re-election. In almost all contemporary democracy, these controlling devices, short tenure and limitation of re-elections, have fallen into disuse. The system of regulating selection of candidates, moreover, adds to this problem, both when it relies on party cooptation and when it is based on primaries in which citizens end up voting on candidates they never helped scout. In fact, on many occasions, primaries are forms of plebiscitary expressions of yes and no. Although they take different forms in different countries, these circumstances of what I call political corruption of the principle of self-government in a representative democracy invariably exacerbate the oligarchical potentials of elections. The nexus of wealth and power is the source of one of the most daunting problems in democracy, and in two senses. First, because wealth can be used to elect reliable representatives. Second, because wealth can be used to manipulate free mandate representation, the central requirement of parliamentary democracy. This manipulation can take different forms. In the United States, for instance, lobbyists monitor congressional votes taken by representatives who may well have been elected thanks to private donors whom lobbyists represent. So the need to keep the system open and power circulating imposes on us permanent maintenance. The matter of how to impede the oligarchic transmutation of representative democracy is the object of a rich corpus of research and constitutional designs today, which hope to contain the elite's power and block the translation of economic power into political power. Thus, we have today two approaches as to what to do to amend these problems. The first approach stresses the need to close the gap within the citizens and the institutions. The other wants instead to manage the gap in a way that is consistent with the expectation of representative democracy without overcoming it. Let's analyze the former group. The former deems party democracy a problem, thus aims at either new forms of representation, for instance, by introducing imperative mandates as the Five Stars movement proposed in Italy, or by changing representation from party representation to representation as embodiment of all the people in a charismatic leader. This would be a populistic transformation of democracy. The second group proposes instead to strengthen the communication between parliament and society and consists in the proposal of integrating the social networks and internet, for instance, with elections, and also to use sortition sometimes to gather citizens for the solution of some very controversial and specific issues. Finally, the proposal of constitutionalizing political parties, and in some countries like Germany, this is already a reality, or of combining direct form of consultation with traditional electoral forms. But in both cases, there is a desire to narrow the gap between government and civil society, and the wish to make transparency the mark of a direct representative relationship. According to this view, for instance, visual inspection and raw information, free of ideology and partisan interpretation, are seen as the key for overcoming parties, which are accused of having primary responsibility for representative politics' perceived decline of legitimacy. This was one of the main issues of many digital parties against the traditional organized parties. This today is a common denominator of several proposals to replace party democracy and electoral representation with digital direct representation and selections by lottery. Recent experimentations of lawmaking and even constitution making with a mix of digital and direct democracy, like in the case of Iceland and even Ireland, and election with a mix of digital democracy and elections, have rekindled traditional discontent with political mandates and even electoral democracy. Now, the internet promises citizens the ability to practice self-government, to ease the process of voting by creating the prospect of more referenda, advance lawmaking initiatives, and send instructions to the elected. Direct interaction that digitalization allows seems capable of narrowing the gap in which special interests maneuver the system. I have elsewhere analyzed this new phenomenon as direct representation versus political mandate representation. Direct representation through internet is the terrain upon which newly born digital movement parties operate in several democratic countries in Europe. They claim it is possible to bypass all parties' organization and its unavoidable oligarchic structure altogether by activating direct channels of horizontal interaction between leaders and citizens. Sometimes, however, the paradox is that these digital movements inaugurate forms of plebiscitary democracy based on an audience and marked by strong vertical leadership that aggregates followers in a void of organization. Therefore, and to come to conclusion, the crisis of parties is today the crisis of parliamentary institutions, full and simple. It is a crisis of the institutions thanks to which the communication between the inside and the outside of and the participation of citizens was organized. And this in my view, appears to be feeding into a crisis of parliamentary democracy. The two aspects, crisis of correlation and communications through intermediary bodies and crisis of legitimacy of parliamentary activities toward the citizens, is today what we call parliamentary democracy, along with the tendency I mentioned at the beginning, exacerbated by this crisis, first the 2008 crisis and then the COVID pandemic, exacerbating the executivism in our parliamentary democracy. So a complex structural condition of challenges and crises we are supposed to face and we have to face. And I think that in these circumstances of politics that should attract our attention. These are the circumstances of politics that should attract our attention. when we complain about today's decline of the democratic tenor of our parliament. And I am confident that democracies scale drastic innovations as it was able to do in the past. We should never forget that democracy was born out of a process of trial and errors 2,500 years and more so ago. And in this process of trials and errors, we are still managing our contemporary representative democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Urbinati, for that challenging presentation and for ending, I think, on quite an optimistic note. I would like now to move to our respondent, Mehreen Khan. I'm very honored to introduce Mehreen Khan. Mehreen is based in Brussels. She is currently the European Union correspondent for the Financial Times. Formerly, she has worked as an economics and finance writer at the Financial Times, and before that as a business reporter at the UK Daily Telegraph newspaper. Mehreen is well known as an expert writer on business and economics, and is a prolific writer and frequently engages in high-level debates on European political and social affairs. Mehreen holds a master's degree from Oxford University, where she started her award-winning journalistic career. Over to you, Mehreen, and thank you very much for joining the conference.
Jonathan, thank you for that very kind introduction, and for Professor Urbinati for a very, very thought-provoking introduction. My job, I guess, as a journalist and not necessarily as a thinker, I think will be to try and to reflect some of the things that I've encountered in my reporting in Brussels, and in particular, what this pandemic has wrought in terms of potential issues of governance. And I might, I don't have the answers, and I'm not in the business where we provide answers. We usually just ask the questions, but hopefully I can put out enough questions for our panelists and people participating to latch onto, and perhaps it can be subjects that we can draw out. I wanted to pick up the last part of what Professor Urbinati was saying for my comments, which is the rise and potential resurgence of the executive during this pandemic, and how that could prove problematic, not just for the parliamentary democracies themselves and their interactions with their executives, but also at the European level, in a project where the governance is based around, I guess, slowly but surely eroding the power of the executive in this supranational and federalist project. What it means if the nation state is coming roaring back. We've seen during the COVID emergency that there have been states of emergencies that have been imposed in lots of European countries due to the nature of what policy responses the pandemic has required. And alongside that state of emergency, we've also seen other security states of emergencies, particularly in the last month or so. We have had major terrorist attacks in France and in Austria. I think the two are quite interesting to see them play out, because you see very much the same kinds of political instincts from governments when they are faced with challenges, which one is like lockdown, keep your citizens and businesses safe, and the other one is the security threat. And I want to sort of pose some questions about things that I have seen in terms of watching the European Union, its members, the politics in its member states play out, and potential issues and questions that should, I think, be posed by our policymakers about what it means in the long run. I think the first thing to start with is the most basic observation that parliaments everywhere are struggling to do their day-to-day business, purely because they are being deprived of the opportunity to meet in a traditional way. So the usual congregation of legislatures is stopped happening because we're all interacting like this. There are some positives in the European Parliament, for example. The voting levels in the plenaries have shot up because it's much easier now for people. They just need to log on rather than physically be in Brussels or Strasbourg to punch in their votes, etc. So there is that slight upside that we are seeing at least an increased efficiency in the way that these parliaments are supposed to work. But for example, Brussels is very much a town that I've noticed that things get done here because you are able to sit around the table and look into the whites of people's eyes and negotiate and come up with those famous or infamous compromises that make the European Union work. That isn't happening so much so with the European Parliament, and I'm sure if there's people, MEPs who are joined today, can probably relay some of that frustration. There is a slight asymmetry because the diplomats actually in the European Council still manage to hold their weekly meetings. You could argue that that is also a reflection of the fact that the crucible of decision making is also shifted, and in some ways has always been the case, has always been with the member states over the parliament. And that has also corrected itself a little bit even more so, where there's an even higher concentration, I think, of power among the European Union's ambassadors, say, compared to its MEPs. And there are various structural reasons for that. Now, maybe talking about I can mention a couple of member states about what has happened to parliaments and what are the pressures they face in states of emergency to potentially expedite legislation that needs to be done because we are in a state of emergency, and maybe not giving it the parliamentary scrutiny that would have otherwise happened in normal times. I think France is probably the most relevant case, where we have seen a number of events in the last couple of weeks, particularly about a global police law, which included one article called Article 24, which would prohibit ordinary citizens from identifying police officers in terms of photographs or video images, if it was to be used to identify them in any way that could to harm them, to cause them any detriment. This has been a crisis that is playing out in France over the last couple of days. I think it's interesting that the article in and of itself was passed by a majority of the French Parliament, including its ruling party. It has subsequently been withdrawn after a controversy about a footage about police beating up a black man, which has caused an uproar in France. And now we're in a process where the article has been suspended. It has been withdrawn. The Prime Minister of France then said that he would redraw the article, not by relying on the Parliament, but by bringing together a technocratic body, including of human rights organizations, to come up and replace this very controversial thing, which had already won the political assent of its parliament. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are going on in this particular case, but it's worth highlighting. One of them is that in terms of just the process of parliamentary democracy, we did go through the right process. This was a law which was proposed by a government in a draft form. It was considered in the parliament and it was finally passed and won a parliamentary majority. We then had a national crisis whereby the law, which had been critiqued heavily by civil society organizations and from journalists in particular for potentially breaching press freedom, was then retracted, and then a technocratic solution was proposed in its place of, I guess in some senses, the parliamentarians thought that they were being bypassed. It will be interesting to see whether more of these types of potential bypassing of parliamentarians could happen, because executives definitely feel that they are able to operate with the level of, I think, political monopoly in security situations and states of emergencies that wouldn't already have been the case. That, I think, is one of the things that I want to highlight about whether we are seeing a slow erosion or even accelerated erosion of the power of parliaments, because they feel like they are under more pressure, or parliamentarians feel like they are more under pressure to expedite legislation without giving it due scrutiny. Otherwise, they will be blamed for holding things up when a country is in a state of emergency. Another parallel conversation is about the role of the European Parliament in the ratification and approval of the European Union's budget. This current budget, which I've been writing about for months and months, is the biggest stimulus package, single stimulus package of 1.8 trillion euros, which the EU will produce as its response to the pandemic. I would be interested to know, and just from my dealings with MEPs on a day-to-day basis, whether there has been some reticence to perhaps pick holes in the budget plan. And one of the conversations we are seeing is actually about the strength of the rule of law mechanism. Because if the end result is that we take a very, very long time, a tortuously long time to come up with an agreement, that the people who suffer are the European Union citizens and the countries that need this money the most. Do they feel political pressure to rubber stamp everything? I mean, ironically, what's happened is the budget is stuck. And it is stuck not because of the MEPs, but because there are other governments involved who are taking issue with this. And for those governments, particularly in Poland and Hungary, I think the political calculation is that if you have a fight with Brussels, it's domestically always going to benefit you. And if that means that countries like Spain and Greece and Portugal don't get their COVID funds as quickly as they wanted it, then so be it, because for them it's a very cynical political calculation. But it is an interesting question to ask whether or not the European Parliament has played its role sufficiently in the general scrutiny of this entire package and its governance at a time when they are under huge amounts of pressure to just get the thing done. Angela Merkel, in July, when the European Council made the deal for this agreement, was very clear in her first press conference after the deal, warning MEPs that she hoped and expected they would not pose a problem for the ratification of this agreement. Because in the eyes, I think, of the German Chancellor and many other European leaders, the crucible of legitimacy in the European Union is not the MEPs. It's actually the member states. And this is a perennial battle between who are the rightful voices of the European citizens in the European Union. Is it the democratically elected governments or is it the democratically elected MEPs? And that's something that we are seeing playing out right now. And maybe my last comment will be about what Professor Urbinati said about how to remedy the crisis in our parliamentary democracies and the two options. And the one I think that is being embraced in the European Union is the strategy which relies on closing the gap between the citizens and those who represent them. And in Brussels, this is a uniquely difficult task because unlike in ordinary member states, Brussels stands as a level of accountability even further away, I think, in the minds of lots of voters. But one of the big democratic experiments that we are due to see in the European Union is something called the Conference on the Future of Europe. This is, I think, based explicitly around a democratic experiment that was had in France with French citizens who gathered around in these sort of agoras to make some of their most pressing priorities known, and it was an exercise where the government then collated all of these responses. And despite the fact that France is a huge country, I think overall it was seen as a genuine success because it did bring and create forums for citizens to be able to discuss things and have their direct representatives there to listen to them. What the actual outcome is, we don't know, but I think even in terms of an exercise, it was valuable, and now potentially France is one of the countries that wants to expand this at the European Union level. Of course, this is the EU, so these grand experiments in citizen democracy are very unwieldy. And as somebody who's watching this debate, I am already concerned that this Conference on the Future of Europe is already getting bogged down in institutional turf wars. It's becoming about who gets to run the conference, where the power centers of the conference are, where the governance is, and the citizens element of it, I think, could already be lost. I think it will be a huge wasted opportunity for the European Union if this conference, which was devised as a grand experiment in rebuilding the trust of EU citizens with the European Unions, falls down the classic rabbit hole of infighting between, MEPs that you've never really heard of and European Union leaders that you've never really heard of because they just want to make sure that it only serves their political interests. I think that's I am being very cynical about this, but history would suggest that cynicism is probably the right way to go because it will be difficult to see how this project is rescued. I would like to hear perhaps from some of the panelists or people who are watching about how they think this could be rescued and whether or not it could become a watermark moment. Think about how to relate to its citizens. There are numerous other questions, of course, about what is put on the agenda of this conference, whether it should finally lead to treaty change, which are the sorts of policies that we want to entrust to our citizens. Health policies become probably the most politically crucial one, given that we have a pandemic and health policy has not been a competence for the European Union. I will end my remarks there. As I said, they are just sort of observations about the things that I've seen in my day-to-day reporting and what I think could be potential problems of governance for the European Union and also for its parliaments during the COVID pandemic, and some of the potentially dangerous things that we've already seen playing out, and whether or not this could be something that gets exacerbated in the future, unless there is a realization among our policymakers that we need to start thinking differently about how we engage with our citizens and our institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Marine, for those very relevant and insightful comments. They're much appreciated. We now are going to move to a question and answer session, and I'd like to start because we're working on in this virtual mode, depending on technology, to explain to you how to ask questions during the Q&A. I see that we already have some questions in, so some people have already figured it out. But first of all, to ask questions, you can use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen if you wish to ask your question in written form, or if you wish to ask a question using your microphone, and you're welcome to do either, then you would need to activate the participants button to find your name in the list and to click raise your hand. So you can see where that is on the screen there in the little graphic. Please note, though, that if you do want to ask a question by audio, that before the host can unmute you, in other words, let you speak, you will have to connect your computer audio in order to be able to ask questions using your microphone. So I invite anyone to send any questions, either to send questions by chat or, as we've said, to raise hands. The first question that I've got on chat is that towards the end of her speech, Nadia Urbinati mentioned the importance of political parties as pillars of representative democracy. But at the same time, we see that parties everywhere, or almost everywhere, are challenged increasingly by low levels of trust, low levels of membership. And the question is, if parties can't perform their representative function, and then at the same time they can't be replaced by other bodies or channels, what happens to our democracies? Perhaps over first to Professor Urbinati, and then if Marine has any comments to add on that.
Excellent. So thank you so much for this very thoughtful question, which is the question in today's reflections upon the transformations of representative and parliamentary democracies. Undoubtedly, parties have been gradually capable of transforming themselves. They didn't disappear. They are chameleontic institutions. They change their physiognomy in order to better resist an environment that requires more selection, more expedited decisions, and also more attention to some special interest, I would say. So definitely political parties are no longer organization of participation parties. They are, as Mayer used to say, Peter May used to say, they are forms of institutionalized entities. They live within the states, out of the states, and by the states as a service they provide for selecting personnel and filling the institutions with their own personnel. So it's a kind of, technically speaking, is a form of oligarchization of party politics. This is for sure. It's everywhere, this phenomenon. And unfortunately, the outcome of this phenomenon has been the contestation that parties, in fact, they represent positions and ideas of the citizens, which are actually in existence as different positions and ideas of the citizens, so that only popular or charismatic leaders are capable of revitalizing this political activity of the citizenry. So here is the conundrum. Either we are capable of putting political parties in actions in a form that is responsive to the people, to the citizens, or really we are in the face of a change of parliamentary democracy, either in a form of plebiscitary of leadership, a la Carl Schmitt, with strong leaders, with strong majorities, and with a low level of pluralism inside of the institution of the parliament, or we face a form of oligarchization of these institutions. That is a problem, and our politicians, ourselves as citizens, we should be aware of that. And thus, what to do with this? Well, we are claiming all the time that we are capable of institutional imagination. This is the time. So there are different possibilities. If we analyze, we make a comparative analysis of how parliamentary democracies works in Europe, we see that they work better, or they are less inefficient or less open to contestation where parties are still structured entities. Think about the case of Germany, which is perhaps the system in which the parties are still a reality. They are not a fake reality. They are real. And why so? Because they have a presence in the constitution. So they've been constitutionalized. So we have to ask this question then. Should parties be simply private association kinds of civil societies? Think about the 5 Stars movement of Podemos. They are civil associations, private organizations capable of amassing a lot of voters and capable of constructing a way to the parliament. So should we stay with these models, civil society model, associational models, or we should think in terms of institutionalizing some of their characteristics and the statutes or the functions they play, or even the ability they have of selecting candidates according to some rules that we have to know about and we have to be conscious about, and we have to reclaim or claim a kind of accountability or not. So this for me is an issue of institutionalizations, not simply of voluntaristic activities of participation, which is important, but by itself, without the other side of the story, that is the institutionalized story, cannot work well. So we are in front of this important decision to be made. In many countries, in my country, to begin with, Italy, which is the turmoil country in relation to the change of parties in a way that is kind of deinstitutionalization of politics in a very clear way. So this is a huge issue, and I don't have any recipe, but at least to show us and to present us with this dual situation, either or. We have to find a way out of this. As it was possible after World War II, this needs to be possible again, because we are in a real moment of transformation in our democracy, I think.
Thanks very much, Nadia. Marine, any comments on parties? What role are parties going to play in democracy moving forward? How can parties overcome the crisis that they seem to be encountering in most European countries?
Yeah, I mean, the country that I know best is the UK, where it's a very we have a monopoly of 2 parties, and I guess the beauty or the danger of it is that those parties in and of themselves have an entire spectrum within themselves. So we have a Conservative Party, which has been known for the last almost over 100 years, whose history is not so much about fighting against the opposition, but fighting among itself. And to have rival wings within those parties to try and represent different interests, which I guess in other European countries would have just been reflected in different parties. So the only resurgent movement and successful one that we've had in the UK in modern history has probably been the UK Independence Party. And the reason it was successful was not in any way because it had any electoral success. It had none because of the nature of the first by the post system that we had, but that eventually it represented an interest, which was in this case the EU's relationship with the European Union, and managed to drum up and make that such a priority that it was then co-opted by parts of the mainstream, which then took it on. And now we are where we are with the current Conservative Party. I'm not sure that there is any model that I think of that works. The other country that I know best because of what I have to cover is the Netherlands, which is the polar opposite, where the barriers to entry for political parties are very, very low. You have over, I think, nearly 20 parties represented in the parliament, from people who represent just animals, a party that represents the over 60s, a party that represents the Turkish minority population in the Netherlands, for example, and this is considered to be, I guess, the balkanization or the fracturing of European parliamentary democracy. But in the Netherlands, it kind of works because you always have to have at least 3 or 4 parties in a coalition, and thus you can find seats wherever you need. And then the culture of compromise dominates. In the UK, of course, it's a system where politics is a blood sport. There's no such thing as compromise, winner takes all, and then you have, 4 or 5 years to run the country as you wish and to change it in your image. As somebody who's slightly younger, I see, and who is politically engaged, I've never been a member of a political party. I've never been exercised enough to even think about having a membership of a political party. And my political activism, just anecdotally, comes in the form of I think, lobbying for certain types of interests, to be involved in civil society organization and NGOs, because even I would see myself as someone who thinks as political parties as a legacy of a system which no longer works. Having said that, I don't know what the answer is, but I think the relationship between, in some European countries, of the state and its civil society organizations is not necessarily a healthy one. In particular, I think in a republican system whereby civil society is sometimes seen as naturally hostile because the state is always going to be the ultimate guarantors of a person's freedoms. And like Nadia said, where you have a system where the political parties are very much constitutionalized, they are part of the institutions. That is also why they are caught up in a general distrust about any types of political mobilization which happens in this old so-called form. And in Britain, for example, we just don't have the dynamism or the entrepreneurial nature to have new resurgent parties or interest groups coming up, because the political system is designed almost deliberately to prevent that. And some would say that Brexit was the moment that system kind of broke.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I mean, one observation I had about the UK Independence Party is that as a party, it doesn't seem to have the characteristics that you would expect, in that it rises at the moment of a particular struggle or crisis around this one particular issue, and then disappears again for potentially long periods of time until the crisis reemerges, and then it comes back to life. So it's certainly a very different kind of party. Just to follow up with Nadia, of course, I'm very, very happy that you're optimistic about the ability of representative democracy to get out of this situation. But you raised the example of how this happened after the Second World War. Of course, the Second World War came about after the collapse of democratic systems in the 1930s and a bloodbath. Is it possible for us to get out, or are we in a death spiral, if you like, or is it possible to get out of that death spiral before this enormous cataclysmic crisis that, of course, we all want to and have to avoid?
Is this a question, right? Now,
it is, if that's okay.
It is a huge question. No, the question is not of optimism or pessimism. The question is, we would like to be able to give ourselves the task that we can fulfill. So what are the tasks that today we can fulfill? So first, we have constitutional representative democracy all over the continent, with some exceptions that are there reminding us of the risk that permanently we face. Hungary and Poland are that threat today, openly said. Second, for sure, we have a system of rule of law, division of powers, constitutionalization of politics. And this, we know what to ask to these important devices. Third, we have a vibrant civil society with many institutions, NGOs, associations, parties, organizations, movements, and this is a richness capable of to be mobilized and to be used in order to legitimize the system itself. So instead of enlarging the distance between the institutions and the people outside, or some of them, not all of them, because I don't think that all people or all institutions or all associations are equally ignored. Some are more seen and heard than others. So there is the possibilities. It depends on us, meaning this is up to us to go on with this form of government or to make radical changes. Maureen made important cases in relation to security emergency and healthcare system provoked emergency. They are very different. I would not merge the two because this would be unjust for us who are trying to resist this pandemic exceptionality, and we, in accepting limitation in our freedom of movement, we show that liberty implies not simply do what you like, but do what you like along with others. So it's a notion of responsibility in citizenship that is important. It's not simply identifiable with repression or diminishing power of our capabilities as citizens. The other kind of emergency is different instead. This requires much of attention because it increases the power of the coercive system and the power of the police. So cannot be identified with the other one. And we have to be very careful. I cannot judge about the French case because I'm not so cautious about it and so knowledgeable about it to do so, but it's a problem. Finally, I would like to simply intervene on one issue that Marine introduced very importantly. So how can we revitalize the parliamentary system through, or the parliamentary democracy in Europe, through different forms of consultations, agora kind of activities? So as we know, this is a huge enterprise for scholars and for politicians, for citizens and opinion makers, and has to do with understanding the enormous possibilities we have now through the internet in order to open channels of communication with citizens, in order to advance forms of consultations, in order to create citizenship representatives that are capable of giving important suggestions, important inputs to the lawmakers. So instead of demonizing these panoply of activities, we should see them as an opportunity for refreshing and readjusting our institutions. So I don't see them as a problem. Of course, this depends on the political leaders inside of our institutions and the political parties leaders and the parliamentarians who they want to, if they want to or not, confront with this challenge, or instead preserve their positions as it is now. So that is to do with an important challenge. It depends on us if we want to take it or not, to the consequences of transforming our system. I think among the questions that we receive, there is a hugely important one concerning Europe.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Urbinati. I'd like to ask next, perhaps starting with Marine, if you could comment on the council blockage by Hungary and Poland regarding the EU budget, in view of this idea of dual legitimacy in EU decision-making. And the questioner asked to what extent it's acceptable that two national governments hold the overwhelming majority of EU citizens hostage on such a crucial matter. And they ask, is qualified majority voting in the council the solution to such a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first big thing that has been exposed by this is the tyranny of the unanimity principle. And it's a unanimity principle which applies on the most sensitive areas of EU policy making when it touches upon the competences of member states. So foreign policy is a big one, and taxation is the other, and of course anything that has anything to do with money. We are in a situation where Hungary and Poland have, to be fair to them, warned for a very, very long time, months, that they would exercise a veto in protest at a rule of law conditionality, which they think is uniquely targeted to those countries. I think what has happened is that there is a series of misunderstandings on both sides, by both sides, about what their incentives are and what would be enough to get them on board. There was, I wouldn't say a complacency, but very much a sort of a latent feeling of satisfaction that ultimately Viktor Orban is a very clever guy. He likes having fights with the European Union, but he likes money more. And ultimately, when it comes to the bottom line, he will not sacrifice tens and billions, nearly 4% of Hungary's GDP, which is transfers from the European Union budget, over this neuralgic issue of the rule of law. It turns out that for Viktor Orban, the calculation, the political calculation is different. Will this move us towards a world of qualified majority voting? I am not hopeful. I mean, even the move towards qualified majority voting requires unanimity to get there. So there's almost a double paradox about how you end up in a world where you are able to strip countries of their vetoes. Will we ever see the unanimity principle be eroded? I think in some areas it's possible. I think in parts of foreign policy, you can start off in a piecemeal way, like talking about sanctions. But when it comes to the European Union budget, because this is still in the minds of member states so much fiercely protected notion about their taxpayers' money. And this is not just something that the East feels strongly. This is in particular something that the richer northern countries feel even more strongly, because they consider themselves to be the European Union's creditors in this sense, and the paymasters. Are we in a world where we can erode some of those barriers? I think no, and this crisis will be resolved in some way. It might take a long while. There will be financial consequences, but I think the thing that will be left is a huge amount of distrust among the body of the European Union, the European Council, which is one which really relies on the people sitting around the table, the leaders, to consider themselves as part of a club, to have skin in the game, to really, to band together in times of crisis. Is creating such a huge amount of distrust towards Hungary and Poland that I think it will take a very, very long time to repair this. In some senses, it could be repaired very quickly if Viktor Orban is no longer the Prime Minister of Hungary and the Polish Law and Justice Party also get booted out, which the EU may think of as an explicit punishment by voters for how they handle this rule of law crisis. In that situation, yeah, that probably could be the best case situation for the European Union, where you have more pro-European and liberal parties in government. If these parties do stick around, which I think has to be our working assumption, then we are already hearing from the more frugal, hawkish parts of Northern Europe that the European Union can't be a place and can't be a community of values with Hungary and Poland inside it. And I'm very surprised that we are even entering that territory, because Brexit apparently had immunized the European Union from thinking about people who want to leave. But that is, I think, a serious conversation that is being had in countries. And I would hold up the Netherlands as one whose domestic parliament is incredibly hostile to the bullying and intimidatory tactics of someone like Viktor Orban. And they can, and the Netherlands, we know, during Eurozone crisis, did consider themselves as paying for the Greeks and paying for the South. And if one thing they really don't want to do is pay for the East, perhaps even more so.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much. Nadia, did you want to speak very quickly for a couple minutes on that question, or shall we move on to, we have a question about the role of the judiciary.
Just one is very, very short. I will be very, very quick. Here in front of us, we have a constitutional crisis. I mean, Europe cannot simply pretend to be, on the one hand, a kind of intergovernmental system of adjustment, and on the other hand, a community. The two are in contradiction. So there is a sense that if situations like the one created by recently by Hungary and Poland, they have to make us understand that we cannot simply go on with this compromissory mentality, which is good to solve a problem, but this is a permanent question of problem solving. It's never end. It's never an end, and this is an erosion of legitimacy at the end of the very European institutions. So this is all.
Great, thank you very much. A question from Peter Savblom. He's asked two questions, one short version and one longer version. I'll ask the short one, and the panelists, I think, can see the longer version as well. He says another pillar of trust as guardians of democracy is the independent judiciary. And he then goes on to talk about the role of the judiciary in defense of democracy, defense of common European values, as in the European Convention for Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. Are we in a danger zone in that area? Again, perhaps back to Marine and then Nadia for short comments for each of you.
I guess Poland again is held up as very much the example of where the dangers of a non-independent judiciary lead to wider erosions in democratic standards. One of the arguments of this rule of law mechanism and one of the clauses states that you need to have an independent judiciary because in a case of potential financial mismanagement in a member state, if that is then taken to a court where the judges are politically biased in some way, then we already are in a situation where you've already lost, and that's why the rule of law is so important. I think it's been difficult. The relationship, the EU is a community of law. It may not be a community of values necessarily, and it may not even be a club of liberal democracies, but it definitely is a community of law, and we see that with the outside role that the ECJ now plays, particularly after the Maastricht Treaty, about how wide its scope is for judgments in all areas of our lives. There was another potential constitutional crisis which was diffused earlier this year, which involved the German Constitutional Court, which for the first time, I think in recent history, issued a judgment where it considered the activities of the ECB to be against the German constitution in terms of its bond buying. And eventually there was a political resolution to this because the judges stepped down and there was enough conciliatory language made by the Bundesbank, the German central bank, to bring this to diffuse this. But I think it was a very interesting case that this idea of judicial supremacy plays two ways. And even though member states who are in the project have signed up to the fact that that EU law is supreme, in member states, particularly in Germany and for historical reasons, that is still an unstable consensus. And that's still a situation which can be tested and has been tested by things like the activities of a European central bank. I remember during that crisis speaking to people in the European Union, particularly in the European Commission, and for them, it was even more existential what could have happened in the German case than things happening in Poland and Hungary. And I think it's an important thing to raise this idea about what being a community of law means if the constituent highest courts in the member states still do not recognize, or in some cases will not recognize the ECJ as being supreme. And in the case of the ECB, I think it was even more politically toxic because there was a public sense in which German people felt that they had been hard done by the European Central Bank, particularly if you were savers. And that is not a crisis that played out. And if it did, I'm wondering the kind of counterfactual where we could have been today. And in some cases, whether thinking about Poland and Hungary is almost much simpler than thinking about cases in which, say, a German constitutional court would not accept judgments of the ECJ.
Great, thank you very much, Marine. Nadia, is there a European community of law? Following on the question and Marine's comments.
Yeah, I agree with Marine on this question, because indeed the strength of European Union, in fact, more than political, is juridical and law, regulations, and institutions that put our life under the same track of in relation to some basic principles. This is what unifies us more than anything else. I think this is a real issue. It's not an issue. It's a good thing, actually. It's not bad. The question is how to combine this legal functionalism that unifies us in some sense with accountability in relation to limits of powers and ability to condition the decisions of the Parliament, of the central institutions in Brussels. So this is more important than simply anything else in this moment, in my view.
That's great. Thank you very much. We have a very interesting question from Giovanni Zenga about digital technologies. If it's okay, Giovanni, I'd like to hold that for our third session, where we're going to look at the impact of COVID and the impact of virtuality, because I think that we'll have time to discuss that interesting question there. We have a question from Zelalem Teshomi Baye, who asks, is it normatively necessary to have an active and physical form of communication, as long as representatives are already elected to serve as trustee? Excellent. So I guess it's this question about communication and and what's the essential form and nature of communication between elected representatives and citizens. Maybe Nadia, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting issue also because we have different layers here of communication. With the pandemic, we saw that even parliamentarians among themselves, they end up by being in indirect interactions as generally they do with us outside of the parliament. So there are different layers of indirectness in communication now, and this is perhaps what is something true new. But again, what in my at least in my understanding is more relevant today is to make this instrument we have, communication through internet, an important useful instrument if we want to communicate directly with the citizens. There are cases, there are with our representatives, there are important cases in which our judgment on how to solve some problems locally is more important than any kind of general reconstructions of the issue and the problems from far away. So issues concerning transportations, infrastructures, some dealing with the territory, with administration of the territory. This is something that we cannot anymore be kept silent or outside of the loop because we want to. And we have the many data and sometimes many possibilities of interacting competently with the institutions. So this needs to be changed in some sense. Change in the sense that the parliament should be able to have external branches capable of communicating with the localities, with the territories, with regions, with the municipals directly through some line. When issues are taken into account, when issues are discussed concerning special issues, special problems connected to the specific area. This can be done. Why not? I don't see any problems with that.
Thanks very much. We're coming towards the end of the session, and so I would like to suggest, Marine, if you had first of all any brief comments on the last question, and then if you'd like to make any summary comments about the discussion that we've had, and then I'll hand it over to Nadia to make the final presenter's comments. Is that okay, Marine?
Sure. Maybe just on that final question, because I'm in Brussels, where voters are uniquely conspicuous by their absence, and they don't really touch the 5 or 6 kilometers of the Schumann roundabout where the policymakers inhabit. But one thing that who I do watch kind of in a semi-anthropological way is how policymakers work. And for them, the physicalness of their jobs is very important. And we saw that in the early phases of the crisis, where the European Union's response to COVID was pretty laboured and pretty slow. And that was still in a world where they were doing everything over Zoom, including the leaders and his finance ministers. And once we got to a point in the pandemic where they were able to sit around across a table, they did it for 5 days, I think, in a week in July and thrashed this thing out. And you know, Brussels, I think a town, I guess you could say like Washington or any other political hub, really relies on that physicality. And in terms of the efficiency of things that have to be done here, I think it does impact the fact that when we can't do that there is a detrimental impact on the outcome and, you know, on the policies themselves. Maybe as a final comment, you know, I have covered domestic politics and now I'm covering the European Union, and as I mentioned, the ideas of voters and of people and of accountability, I think there is still a systemic problem in the DNA and even in the mindset of the European Union when it really comes to thinking about things like direct accountability. Lots of people pay lip service to the idea that they are democratically elected, for example, just because they are MEPs. But in truth, as MEPs, most of their daily interactions when it comes to their jobs is talking to interest groups, and in particular, the thousands of lobbyists on various topics. And those are the people that have access to MEPs. Those are probably the people who know who their MEPs are. And I'm not saying this is uniformly true, because there are some very brilliant MEPs whose actually most of their jobs is them actually, you know, talking to their constituents in their member states rather than being in Brussels. So there are different models of MEPs. But I think if the conversation about accountability, about how to restore trust, about how to think innovatively about our democracies is going to happen in Europe, I don't think it's going to happen in Brussels. I think it will happen in the individual member states, and maybe they will have ripple effects that touch upon us here in Brussels. But one of the things, I think the most frustrating parts of this job and covering this job as a journalist is that you're very much covering the policymakers and the policies, and you're very rarely thinking about the people. I wish that was different. Maybe if you speak to the FT's Brussels correspondent in 50 years' time, they will tell you something completely different. But in 2020, sadly, I still think we're stuck in a world where it is too much of an isolated bubble, where the accountability mechanisms do not exist. And that's probably why the EU will face far more severe crisis of its legitimacy, far worse than Brexit. And we're probably actually in one right now, as we mentioned, with Poland and Hungary. And I think there will be many more.
Thank you very much, Marine. And for the final word, Professor Urbinati.
Well, this is a very difficult task, because I have to, in some sense, again, to play the game of optimism, because after this presentation by Marine, what can I say? Okay, give up to everything. We have, a despair. No, well, yes and no. Yes and no, as usual. Yes, because problems are there. For instance, after the referendum in France and in Denmark that blocked the possibility of having a constitutional organization of our European Union, of course, everything has been managed according to comitologism and comitologists and lobbyism and so on and so forth, without the transparency that then accountability would require. This is for sure. So the question is, indeed, do we want to create a political Europe or not? If we don't want to create a political Europe, perhaps we don't. Then this kind of legal, bureaucratic, and regulatory system works well in relation to some particular moments or issues. I doubt that this can be the case, because we have huge issues, from immigrations to healthcare and to climate, that they require, in fact, cooperation between nations and among nations. So the European Union, with all its baroque organization and baroque system, is still an important moment for dealing with issues that are more and more not simply national. So we can strengthen democracy locally, fine, but we need to have a system capable of post-national system, capable of transnational system, capable of dealing with some important issues that are going to impact local or national communities. So, willing or not, we have to deal with Europe. And thus, the question is whether we want to have Europe as it is now, or thanks also to Recovery Fund, thanks also to a new climate policy that is going to change with Europe. We never touch on the US, but the new change of the White House will have an impact in the way in which we can deal with these important issues, more cooperative, Atlantically speaking, and also perhaps with a more attentiveness to moments of not simply nationalism or sovereignty, but more internationalist and more connected to the outside. So this is my answer. It's a long rhetorical answer to a real issue that we Europeans are going to face. This is our continent, and we have to deal with it in some sense, and day by day. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nadia, and thank you, Marine, for excellent presentations. And also for very interesting answers to the questions and dialogues. I would like most of all, I suppose, to thank our participants. We had over 250 registrants for this event, and we had a number of very interesting questions. I couldn't get to all of them, but what I'm hoping is that we will be able to answer your questions in the next sessions of the conference. And if we can put up on the screen when the next session is coming, I'd also like to say that that we had a very interesting and very relevant question from Karen Melchior, which will be which will be perfect to lead into our second session. So Karen asked if we could integrate deliberative democracy into the politics of Brussels, and that would be great. Well, this question is really the question that we are devoting our entire second session to. So I encourage Karen and everybody else to participate in that, and we will have answers to that question and many related questions. So it's on the 8th of December, at the same time as this event, so between 3 o'clock and 4:30 at Brussels time. And the topic of the session is deliberative democracy, impact on parliaments. And we're going to see many different examples. We have a number of speakers with great practical and scholarly experience working on deliberative democracy. And we really, really look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again, Marine. Thank you again, Nadia. And thank you everybody for participating.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank
Ciao.
you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.